You awaken in marble halls that glisten like flesh, slick with spilled wine and sweat, the floor breathing beneath your bare feet as though it remembers every collapse that ever stained it. The air is too thick to breathe. It tastes of iron and rot beneath the perfume, as if the sweetness itself has soured into decay. Laughter erupts in sudden bursts, but it does not sound human, more like the shrill cry of birds tearing meat from bone. You hear it echo across the walls, and yet the laughter does not belong to joy. It is the sound of suffering forced to dance in the mask of delight. These halls are not a palace. They are a stage. And on this stage the play is desecration. The emperor sits high upon his throne, but it is not a throne. It is a butcher's seat draped in silk. His eyes glimmer with something colder than cruelty. They do not look at people as people, but as wax to be melted, as clay to be reshaped, as bodies to be ruined. Desire here is not tender, not seeking connection, not reaching for warmth. It is sharpened into a weapon, its edge gleaming brighter than any sword Rome ever forged. Every glance you feel upon you is not admiration but intrusion, a stripping away, a reminder that flesh is not yours. It is his and always his until he has taken it apart. You hear the rustle of robes, the clinking of goblets, the scraping of sandals against marble floors. Yet beneath these sounds hums something worse, the silence of fear. Senators, generals, noble wives, all gathered like cattle in silk, their faces frozen into masks of admiration while their eyes scream for escape. You realize that here, every feast is a spectacle, every breath a performance, every body a prop. No word is spoken without trembling, no smile appears without coercion. The court is not an audience. It is a prison of witnesses forced to applaud what they cannot bear to see. You feel their gaze pressing into you, the weight of their shame settling like stones across your chest. To be in this hall is to suffocate on the knowledge that you are always being watched, not as a person but as a victim in waiting, a piece of theater to be broken apart when the emperor decides the silence has lingered too long. The sound of his voice cuts through the air like glass. It is calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes before blood is spilled. He smiles, but the smile is wrong, an imitation of joy stretched across cruelty. The smile does not warm the room. It chills it, the way frost eats through windows in the dead of winter. The wine flows, red as wounds, splashing onto the floor where it mingles with older stains. You think of all the feasts before, of the countless nights where the same performance unfolded. Desire turned into humiliation, pleasure into punishment, intimacy into mockery. Here ruin is the only ecstasy. The emperor leans forward, and the crowd tenses as though the walls themselves might collapse. You feel the chamber shrink, pressing you closer to the spectacle that is about to begin. And in this moment, something inside you breaks. The illusion that this is history, distant and cold. No, you are not standing centuries away, safe in the present. You are here in the chamber where morality has already rotted. You smell the rot in the breath of the courtiers, you hear it in the crack of laughter, you taste it in the air that refuses to leave your lungs. You are not learning about Caligula, you are trapped within him, caught in the shadow of his desire, forced to stand as dignity itself is dissolved into grotesque performance. And you know this is only the beginning. Each act will carve deeper, each spectacle will burn brighter, each desecration will drag you closer to collapse. The nightmare does not promise escape, it promises descent. The first practice awaits, a theater of humiliation that will make these marble halls feel smaller, darker, heavier. You step forward, and the sound of your footsteps vanishes into silence, swallowed by the abyss of what comes next. The first of Caligula's brutal practices is not whispered in shadow but performed beneath the blinding glare of torches. You are dragged into the heart of the hall, where marble pillars rise like skeletal witnesses, their surfaces stained with the echoes of laughter that has outlived the men who once forced it. The emperor's cruelty was never content with secrecy. He wanted his power to be tasted on every tongue, burned into every eye, swallowed like poison until no soul could claim ignorance of what Rome had become. What should have been hidden was dragged into spectacle, intimacy stripped bare and nailed to the stage for all to see. You stand among the crowd, their robes heavy with wealth, their faces painted with obedience. Yet beneath the gold, beneath the jewels, you smell fear, sour, acrid, undeniable. It clings to them more than perfume, thick as the incense that chokes the chamber. They cannot look away. No one can. Fathers sit paralyzed, their hands knotted into fists that dare not move, their faces carved into statues of shame as daughters are claimed in the theater of power. Mothers bite their lips until blood stains their teeth, but they cannot cry out. Senators smile with lips that tremble, forced to mimic delight while their souls fracture beneath the weight of humiliation. Every moment is calculated. Caligula does not merely desecrate, he orchestrates. His cruelty is theater, his victims actors, his court the audience. And yet there is no applause, not the kind that lives in truth. What fills the chamber is worse. The sound of hands striking together with hollow rhythm, forced, mechanical, suffocating in its emptiness. You hear it not as clapping but as chains rattling, as the echo of servitude given shape. That applause becomes thunder in your ears, louder than screams, louder than sobs. And when it stops, the silence devours the room. That silence is heavier than death itself. You feel your chest tighten as you realize what has been taken here is not flesh alone, but dignity. To be stripped in body is one thing. To be stripped in soul before the eyes of family, of peers, of enemies, that is annihilation. The sacred line between the private and the public has been shattered, ground into dust beneath the emperor's heel. What was once intimate becomes grotesque. What was once human becomes theater. What was once sacred becomes a weapon. And yet the horror lies not only in the spectacle, but in its endurance. The court does not rebel. The fathers do not rise. The senators do not resist. Fear stitches their mouths shut, and survival demands complicity. You realize then that Caligula's cruelty does not end with his victims. It spreads outward like rot, forcing every witness into the crime. Every silence becomes consent. Every smile becomes betrayal. The empire itself becomes an accomplice. You cannot breathe. You want to look away, but the emperor's gaze pins you like an insect on bronze. You taste bile at the back of your throat, but you swallow it because you know, to retch is to be noticed, and to be noticed is to be chosen. You stand in the stench of humiliation, and you understand that shame has become currency. Rome does not trade in gold tonight. It trades in silence, in obedience, in the mutilation of the sacred. This is not governance. This is not rule. This is circus, desecration masked as theater. Caligula's Rome is a carnival of violation, where power is proven not by armies or laws but by how deeply one man can twist the soul of his people until they applaud their own degradation. And as the torches flicker and the silence spreads like oil across the floor, you know the nightmare has only begun. For the next desecration waits, one that crawls deeper, striking not only the body but the blood itself. You are forced to witness the collapse of the most sacred boundary, the line carved not by law but by blood itself. You thought the family bond was unbreakable, a sanctuary immune to power's intrusion, but here in Caligula's Rome, even kinship is dragged into the furnace of spectacle. The emperor does not hunger for flesh alone. His true desire is desecration. He takes what is holy and reduces it to parody. He poisons the fountain at its source so that all who drink from it are stained forever. You see mothers trembling, clutching their garments as though fabric could shield them from the gaze that strips everything bare. You see brothers lowering their heads, their eyes burning with the shame of helplessness, unable to rise without condemning themselves to ruin. You see entire lineages tarnished in a single night, their names forever entangled with the emperor's cruelty. The horror is not in detail but in meaning. Flesh can heal, but lineage cannot. Once desecrated, the family bond becomes a wound that bleeds through generations. It is as though Caligula understood that to dominate a man's bloodline is to dominate his eternity. What he sought was not intimacy, not even indulgence. It was annihilation of innocence at its root. You hear the whispers of senators who dare not speak aloud. You sense the despair of wives who weep into silent cloth. You feel the suffocating dread of children who learn too early that no bond is safe. And Rome gasps, its values rotting in the shadows of its own palace. The grotesque truth presses against your chest. Intimacy has been transformed into a grave, a burial mound for purity itself. You feel it closing in, the air heavier with every heartbeat, as though morality is being strangled before your eyes. Kinship is no longer refuge, it is another stage. Bloodlines are no longer sacred, they are props for theater. Innocence is not protected, it is paraded, mocked, consumed. And beneath the grotesque spectacle lies the deeper wound. Philosophy itself convulses. If family can be corrupted, then nothing is untouchable. If blood can be weaponized, then loyalty itself is meaningless. What use is love when fear can bend it, when shame can unmake it? You hear the question pounding in your skull. If power can sever the most sacred bond, then what remains of society at all? The silence gives you no answer, only the echo of Rome's collapse played out in whispers, in glances, in the unspoken terror of those who survive by betraying their own hearts. This realization does not belong only to history. You shiver because you sense it clawing at the present, a truth too sharp to ignore. The nightmare is not ancient, it is eternal. Wherever power seeks to corrupt, wherever innocence can be bought, wherever families are broken by hands stronger than justice, the shadow of Caligula walks again. His Rome is not buried, it lives, festering in every age, waiting to be unmasked. You cannot escape the weight of it. You feel as though the marble pillars lean inward, pressing down, suffocating, forcing you to bow to the realization that nothing stands untouched. No bond is safe. No sanctuary is sacred. The collapse of bloodlines is not only Rome's story, it is the story of humanity's fragility, whispered through centuries like a curse. And yet even this is not the final desecration. For Caligula's appetite did not stop at blood. Having conquered the family, he reached for the heavens themselves, staining not only mortal kinship but the sacred realm of the divine. For the palace does not satisfy him. Its marble halls, already swollen with echoes of shame, are too narrow for his hunger. His cruelty seeks a stage larger than flesh and family, larger than senators and slaves. And so his shadow slithers into the temples, into the sanctuaries where mortals once whispered their fears to the gods. You step into a holy shrine expecting silence, but the air greets you with another scent, thick, cloying, unmistakable. The incense no longer smells of worship. It reeks of sweat, of violation, of sanctity collapsing into ruin. The candles flicker, their flames coughing in the smoke that has become poison. Once, these flames were symbols of prayers rising to heaven. Now they are witnesses, trembling as though they too know what has been done here. The marble altars shine in the dim light, but their whiteness is stained, not with sacred offerings but with humiliation ground into stone. The grooves carved for sacrifice are darkened by what should never have touched them. The temple floor feels alive under your feet, sticky with the residue of desecration, as though the gods themselves have wept into the stone. And there at the center stands the emperor, Caligula, draped not in humility but in blasphemy. His body does not bend in prayer, it conquers. His gaze does not lift to the heavens, it drags the divine down into the dirt. What he performs is not ritual but parody, a grotesque imitation of devotion meant only to mock. The priests stand nearby, their robes heavy, their mouths sewn shut by fear. Their faces are pale masks, frozen between outrage and terror. They know that to protest is to die, but worse, to remain silent is to become complicit. They choose survival, and in their silence, the gods themselves are betrayed. You feel the suffocation build in your chest. If even the sacred can be mocked, then what hope remains for mortals? If temples themselves can be reduced to stages of defilement, then no stone, no altar, no prayer is safe. You begin to realize that Caligula's practices are not indulgences of a man driven by lust. They are acts of erasure. Every desecration is deliberate. Every humiliation is calculated. He is not content to ruin bodies. He wants to ruin meaning itself. The holy becomes profane, intimacy becomes annihilation, worship becomes laughter in the mouth of cruelty. The grotesque imagery sears itself into your mind. Statues of gods watching with blind eyes, their marble faces streaked with candle wax that drips like tears. Golden chalices overturned, their contents spilling like blood upon the floor. Curtains torn, revealing the sanctum not as sanctuary but as theater. The temple itself moans beneath the weight of parody. The echoes of sacred hymns are drowned by the forced sounds of humiliation. And you stand there, unable to move, your body rooted to the floor as though the stone itself has wrapped around your ankles. You feel the despair carve into your chest, sharper than any blade. For if gods can be mocked, then what remains to protect mortals? If the divine can be enslaved to cruelty, then all prayers are meaningless, all rituals hollow, all hope already strangled. This is the revelation that suffocates you. Caligula's cruelty is not random, not madness, not mere indulgence. It is philosophy. A dark creed of annihilation. Desire has become nihilism. Power has become desecration. He does not simply break laws, he breaks meaning. He does not only wound bodies, he wounds reality. And yet, even here, you sense the nightmare has not reached its deepest pit. For what begins in parody soon mutates into punishment. What masquerades as ritual soon becomes torment. His appetite shifts beyond pleasure, beyond blasphemy, into the realm of cruelty crafted for domination alone. The shrine fades into shadow, and you are dragged into the next chamber of horror, where indulgence is no longer indulgence. It is execution dressed in velvet. Here the mask slips. The smile of indulgence rots into a sneer of cruelty, and the theater of excess folds inward into something darker. You are no longer standing in a palace. The marble and gold vanish. In their place rises a dungeon painted with velvet, its luxury only a disguise for its rot. The torches flicker on walls draped in fabric too heavy to muffle the cries that once seeped through. What you breathe is not incense but dampness, sweat, and iron, the scent of fear crystallized into air. Caligula's hand no longer reaches for pleasure. It reaches for torment. Desire, once paraded as indulgence, is revealed for what it always was: punishment. His power does not rest in the act itself but in what the act destroys. He forces bodies into motions they cannot escape, each gesture carving scars beyond the flesh. The velvet cushions of the chamber do not comfort. They smother, swallowing screams, transforming them into whispers no one dares to repeat. The emperor sits enthroned in his cruelty, not aroused by intimacy but by the spectacle of survival turned into suffering. What makes this grotesque is not death, it is the refusal of death. His victims are broken not by the finality of silence but by the unbearable burden of living afterward. They walk out of his chambers with eyes hollowed, their dignity gnawed by shame that festers like rats in the dark. Every step beyond those doors is haunted. Every look they receive is tainted. To survive him is not to live but to carry wounds that never close, a punishment more enduring than execution. You feel the walls closing in, suffocation setting deep in your chest. The velvet-lined dungeon becomes a coffin you cannot escape. You realize that in Caligula's Rome, cruelty and indulgence are not separate. They are twins, joined at the throat. His pleasure is not measured in size but in tears, not in closeness but in collapse. And once this realization pierces you, despair follows like a tide. There is no escape because survival itself is worse than death. The imagery becomes unbearable. Imagine a senator, once a man of stature, stumbling from the chamber, his toga ripped, his eyes cast forever downward. Imagine a noblewoman, forced into a spectacle that will echo through every whisper in Rome, her name no longer a lineage but a stain. These survivors do not heal. They dissolve, eroded from within, ghosts while still breathing. Their punishment is memory, sharpened and renewed each day they awaken to live again. Caligula knew this. He wielded it with precision. To him, survival was a leash, humiliation the chain, and shame the collar. His acts were not accidents of madness but calculated instruments of domination. He had no need to spill blood when he could unravel a soul strand by strand, leaving a body alive but hollowed into a husk. And now you, the witness, feel the despair uncoil inside you. The dungeon's velvet no longer feels soft. It feels suffocating, wrapping tighter with each breath. The laughter you hear is not joy but mockery, echoing against the stone until it becomes a roar inside your skull. You realize the deepest cruelty. There was never a line between indulgence and punishment, between desire and torment. They are one, fused into a nightmare without boundaries. This is the emotional collapse of the narrative, where the horror ceases to be spectacle and becomes suffocation. You understand why whispers of his reign still curdle blood centuries later. It was not the bodies he destroyed but the humanity he stripped, leaving the survivors to carry his reign as a scar carved into their very being. The despair spreads like a shadow, preparing you for what comes next. For if survival itself is punishment, then the nightmare can still deepen. Section 6 builds toward the climax, dragging you into the emperor's darkest practice, the one that suffocates not only body and soul but history itself. The climax arrives not with a blade but with a banquet. You sit at a long marble table that stretches into shadow, its surface gleaming like bone. Silver goblets tremble in your hand, though you dare not spill a drop. The room hums with a silence that is not quiet but suffocation, every breath caught in throats that dare not release it. Around you, men and women are gathered, but they are not guests. They are victims, paraded as ornaments for the emperor's entertainment, living offerings to his appetite for ruin. The air is heavy, almost sweet. Perfume pours through the hall in thick waves, meant to mask the stench that clings to the corners. The rot of food untouched, the sweat of fear, the faint metallic echo of shame. Golden bowls overflow with fruit already turning soft, meat glistening under candlelight yet crawling inward with decay. It is not a feast but a mausoleum of indulgence, where the grandeur of Rome collapses under the weight of its own grotesque theater. Caligula sits at the head, his eyes gleaming with delight not at the meal but at the spectacle of degradation unfolding before him. Each body at the table becomes a prop in his cruel pageantry, a marionette pulled into grotesque parody. What should be gestures of intimacy are twisted into mockeries, laughter commanded like applause at a play staged in hell. You look to your side and see the rigid smiles of senators, their faces cracked by terror, clapping hands that shake with dread. The forced applause is louder than any music could be, and yet beneath it you hear the muffled sobs of those who cannot hold their silence. Every act is another nail hammered into the coffin of Rome's morality. Here, the family bond lies broken, the sanctity of worship mocked, the dignity of governance ridiculed. You understand that this table is not merely a stage. It is an execution ground where no blood is shed yet countless souls are killed. It is luxury fused with horror, decadence braided with death, each jeweled dish another mask for the void spreading through the empire's heart. Your chest tightens. The banquet becomes unbearable, a nightmare you cannot leave. The goblet in your hand feels heavier, as though filled not with wine but with the weight of complicity. To drink is to agree, yet to refuse is to invite ruin. You realize this is the essence of Caligula's reign, not merely to destroy, but to make destruction the only language, the only song that Rome can sing. Every guest at the table is both victim and witness, both humiliated and silenced, their suffering transformed into entertainment for one man's throne. And so you sit caught between terror and despair. The banquet stretches on, timeless, endless, a ritual not of nourishment but of desecration. The music of sobs replaces the lyres, the rhythm of forced clapping replaces drums, until the hall feels less like a palace and more like a tomb. You sense the collapse is complete. This is not Rome at its height but Rome rotting from within, a carcass draped in gold. The emotional suffocation reaches its peak. You feel the walls closing in, the candle flames dimming into suffocating smoke, the golden bowls gleaming like funeral urns. There is no laughter here, only echoes of mockery. There is no feast, only the massacre of dignity. This is the breaking point, the nightmare banquet from which there is no exit. You, the witness, are chained to the table by silence, as much a prisoner as those paraded before the emperor. The horror is total, and the realization sharpens. The feast is not for the body but for cruelty itself, indulgence served not on plates but on souls. Section 7 drags you into reflection, into the ashes left behind when such desecration devours everything. What remains when even a banquet becomes a grave? After the banquet, silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a battlefield after the dead have been cleared, the kind that lingers like a foul vapor in the lungs. You wander the corridors, each step sticking to marble floors lacquered with a glaze of spilled wine and blood, as if the palace itself bleeds and weeps beneath your feet. The torches sputter, their flames stuttering against stone walls streaked with stains that will never fade. The air tastes metallic, like a coin pressed too long against your tongue, mingling with the ghost of perfume that once promised sweetness but now suffocates like rot. You hear laughter, but it no longer sounds like laughter. It echoes from the far corners, warped, hollow, stripped of joy. These are not human sounds anymore, but ghosts rehearsing their humiliation again and again in eternal performance. Rome itself feels haunted, not by spirits of the dead but by the degradation of the living. You sense that this is what remains after cruelty takes root, not scars alone, but echoes that refuse to die, rippling through corridors long after the feast has ended. As you walk, the nightmare does not end, it changes shape. The acts you witnessed were monstrous, but worse than the acts is the residue they leave behind. Every boundary was broken. Intimacy turned to spectacle, family turned to theater, temples turned to playgrounds of mockery. What happens when nothing remains sacred? What happens when meaning itself is fed into the jaws of power, chewed and spat into silence? The horror was never only in the cruelty, it was in the erasure of meaning. The empire cracks quietly like marble under too much weight. Rome was not built on stone alone but on trust, on belief in family, in gods, in the idea that certain bonds were untouchable. Caligula shattered those bonds, not by accident but by intent. His cruelty was not just indulgence, it was philosophy made into terror, a declaration that nothing was beyond him, not body, not blood, not God. He turned Rome itself into a stage, and when the curtain fell, there was nothing left but ruins disguised as splendor. You pause in the shadow of a column, pressing your hand against cold stone. It feels solid, eternal, yet you know it is already crumbling. Decay does not announce itself loudly. It seeps, it spreads, it consumes from within. That is the fate of power without morality. It devours not only its victims but its own foundations, hollowing out the society it claims to rule. Rome, the eternal city, begins to rot from the inside, its empire corroded by the desecration of its own soul. You reflect, and the reflection is unbearable. These horrors are not ancient, they are eternal. Every age flirts with its own Caligula, with power unbound, with cruelty disguised as necessity, with indulgence raised above dignity. The corridors you walk are not just Rome's. They are every empire's, every nation's, every society that forgets that morality is the skeleton holding its body upright. Strip away that skeleton and collapse is inevitable. The silence tightens around you. It is not empty, it is filled with lessons too heavy to carry. You feel them pressing into your chest. That intimacy without respect becomes humiliation. That family without sanctity becomes theater. That faith without reverence becomes mockery. Strip away those meanings and nothing remains but shadows clinging to ruined walls. And so you keep walking. The laughter fades, the torchlight flickers out, and the corridors swallow you whole. There are no screams now, no applause, no commands, only silence. A silence that is not peace, but aftermath. A silence that lingers like a wound. The nightmare ends not with screams but with silence. You stand before the grave of Caligula, though no marker truly dares to carry his name. The soil lies heavy, packed as if to smother the memory of what it covers, and the air above is still, as though Rome itself is holding its breath. History will tell you he was struck down by the very men who once bowed before him, assassinated in a flurry of blades meant to end a reign of madness. But memory whispers something darker, something the records cannot contain, that his true legacy is not in his death but in the ruins he carved into every body he touched, every temple he mocked, every bond he broke. The grave is shallow compared to the abyss he left behind. You kneel and the earth feels colder than stone. There is no monument, no marble statue to soften the truth. Even had they raised one, it would have crumbled under the weight of desecration. For how do you chisel into stone what was done in shadows, in whispers, in forced laughter that disguised sobs? How do you immortalize humiliation? A grave may hide bones, but it cannot bury echoes. The silence that surrounds you now is louder than the torches that once burned in his halls, louder than the applause he once commanded. The reflection is stark. Empires do not collapse from swords alone. The steel that pierced his body was only the final act, the closing curtain of a performance long since rotted from within. Rome's decay was written in the desecration of intimacy, in the corruption of family, in the mockery of its gods. A society's foundation is not its armies or its walls, but its meanings, and Caligula unmade them all. He turned pleasure into annihilation, intimacy into a battlefield, the sacred into spectacle. He did not simply abuse power. He hollowed out the very idea of power until it became indistinguishable from cruelty. You feel the silence pressing down on you, heavier than marble, heavier than time itself. It suffocates not because it is empty, but because it is full of everything that cannot be spoken. Beneath your feet lies not just one man's corpse, but the residue of a reign that taught Rome the price of forgetting morality. You hear nothing, yet the silence is crowded with the unending weeping of those who were forced to laugh, the groans of priests who stood powerless, the shamed whispers of families broken beyond repair. The soil covers bones, but it cannot cover memory. You realize then that the nightmare has not ended, it has only been sealed. History chooses what to remember, but memory chooses what to haunt. And this grave is a wound that will not close. You sense that every empire carries within it this same seed, the same grotesque possibility. Not always with Caligula's face, not always with Rome's grandeur, but always with the temptation of power unbound, of morality stripped for indulgence, of leaders who mistake domination for divinity. The silence grows heavier, thick like fog in your lungs. You cannot move, for the weight of reflection pins you where you stand. What was done cannot be undone. No sword can erase humiliation. No monument can restore dignity. No grave can silence echoes. The nightmare ends here, but the suffocation remains. And as you turn away, the final truth drags itself behind you like a chain. History is not only written in victories and battles, but in what it tries to forget, in the wounds carved not just into flesh but into memory. Some scars do not fade. Some silences do not heal. And in that silence, you realize every empire already hears the sound of its own collapse.